A very good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hindu News Analysis brought to you by Shankar IAS Academy. In today's discussion, we have a cocktail of articles ranging from international relations to art and culture to social issues to geography. And today's discussion will largely be based on editorials, and in that aspect, our discussion will have a discussion on India-US relations, and in art and culture aspect, we'll be talking about Kathakali. And if you remember, few days ago in my class, we were also talking about the classical dances. We discussed about two other classical dances. For regular viewers, if at all you remember, please post it in the comment section. And in today's discussion, our art and culture aspect will focus on Kathakali specifically. And the social security for workers will also be discussed based on the periodic labor force survey. And horizontal reservations is one of the important topics that we will be taking up for discussion today. And apart from that, we will also be discussing about Iran's political geography in specific. And from the economics, we will be discussing insolvency in particular and how it has progressed over the years. And apart from that, we have three more editorials, and these three editorials are more of a repetition of the previous discussions we have already had. So all these three editorials will only be a passing reference in our discussion today. So with that knowledge, let's get into the discussion for today. See, this article reports about the inauguration of Ebrahim Raisi as the President of Iran. There's a power transition happening, and this event has happened at a time when Iran is hoping to shake off its serious economic crisis on reviving a nuclear deal with world powers. So in this light, let us see some important facts about Iran in the preliminary perspective, especially focus on the borders and the deserts in that particular country, which is very important from the preliminary exam point of view. So look at the map. Keep your eyes on the map as I talk. So as we know, Iran is a mountainous, arid and ethically diverse country that lies in the southwestern part of Asia, and its capital is Tehran. And most parts of the Iran consist of the central desert plateau, which is attached by lofty mountains on all sides. And on talking about its borders, now pay attention to the map more closely. Iran is bounded by Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkmenistan and Caspian Sea to the north. So in the north we have a water body as well. Remember that. And by Pakistan and Afghanistan to the east. And then we have Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman as its borders to its south. And if you see the west, it is bordered by Turkey and Iraq. So let's go over it one by one again. We have Turkey and Iraq to its west. We have Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman to its south. So the southern borders are marine. And we have Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkmenistan in the north. Apart from that, we also have a water body which is Caspian Sea. And we have Pakistan and Afghanistan to the east. See, this is also important because generally there is a Chanakya rule in international diplomacy. Keep your enemy's neighbor as your friend. So India always tries to foster a good relations with Iran, and as you can see, it shares borders with Pakistan. So because it shares borders with Pakistan, we try to have a good relations with Iran. And apart from that, Iran can also act as a gateway to the Central Asia, from which India has largely remained cut off. So India has also constructed a port in the Iran, and that port is called as Chabar Port, and that is very strategically important as well. And from Iran into Afghanistan, we can actually reach the Central Asia. Central Asia is very important because it has a lot of resources, right from oil to lithium. So that is exactly why Central Asia is important, and we consider Iran as a gateway to Central Asia. So coming back to the map discussion, as you can see in the map, Persian Gulf is situated in the south of Iran, and know that the Persian Gulf is one of the warmest bodies of water in the entire Middle East. So can any of you guess why is Persian Gulf the warmest body in the entire Middle East? If you actually can guess the answer, Just keep it in mind. I'll tell you the answer towards the end of this segment. So coming back to the discussion, and during summer, the temperature of the water in this Gulf amounts to 65 degrees Celsius. And likewise, the Caspian Sea is the largest body of inland water all over the world, which is situated to the north of Iran. So this is why it is all important. And now let's talk about the deserts. These deserts are very important. Know that there are two main deserts in Iran. That is Dasht-e-Kavir and Kavir-i-Lath. So these are the two important deserts. See, the Dasht-e-Kavir is also called as the Great Salt Desert. And it is the largest desert in the country, and it is a primarily uninhabited wasteland only, which is composed of mud and salt and marshes, and it is all covered with crusts of salt. So it is primarily uninhabited. You can't do agriculture or anything on these lands, and it is these salts that help in protecting the meager moisture from completely evaporating as well. So remember this point from the geography perspective. Now on talking about Kavir-i-Lath, see, this desert is located in the southeast of the country, and this arid subtropical area is swept by strong winds which transport sediment and can cause alien erosion on a larger scale. So these are some of the important points that we need to have in mind when it comes to the geography of Iran. So in the meantime, we also saw why the temperature of the Persian Gulf is very high. See, when you learn about the land water distribution, any water body that lies proximal to a land mass, that will always have a higher temperature. Okay, and also the incoming water inside that water body also matters. So as you can see, in the Persian Gulf, not many rivers drain. There are two principal rivers that drain into the Persian Gulf, and apart from that, it also lying to very hot areas. You know, the Middle East are very hot areas. They are all deserts and all. So Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they're very enclosed also because of the proximity to the land surface, and because of the very little incoming water sources. This sea is one of the hottest sea in the world. So with that knowledge in mind, let's move on to the next segment of today's discussion. Now, let us take up this news article. So, this article is regarding a report submitted by the departmentally related Standing Committee on Labour, and the report was on the impact of COVID-19 on rising unemployment and loss of jobs or livelihoods in organized and unorganized sector. See, the upcoming discussion is largely based on the unemployment status in India and the ways that the committee has suggested to overcome the existing sad state of affairs. So for any mains question that mandates you to talk about the unemployment status in India and the ways to overcome it, you can take the upcoming discussion as it is as your mains answer. So pay attention. Right? So, as per the Periodic Labour Force Survey, 90% of workers in India were in the informal sector. So, this roughly makes about 419 million of the 465 million workers. See, understand the amount of manpower that we have. See, the entire population of US itself is around 300 million. But our unorganized sector alone contributes to 419 million. So that is the amount of manpower that we have. Now coming back to the discussion, this huge majority of India's workforce has been severely affected by the ongoing pandemic. And as per the Periodic Labour Force Survey report, for the April-June 2020, unemployment rate in urban areas for those above 15 years was about 20.8%. That is, for those people who have age above 15 years, of every 100 people, 20 people or 21 people are unemployed. So what does this indicate? This apparently indicates an increase of 9.1% in January to March 2020 thanks to the pandemic. Now let us discuss some of the important observations made by the committee. See, the committee highlighted major thrust areas to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on unemployment and joblessness. They are formalizing the unorganized sector, increasing the productivity, strengthening and upgrading the existing livelihoods, and creating new opportunities. See, for any unemployment related solution, these 4 verticals assumes very much a center stage. So let us understand this better. First is formalizing the unorganized sector. So what is formalizing an unorganized sector? See, most of the businesses in India, they are not even registered. Most of them, they do business from home or from a village without any registration, and the workers there, they are also not registered. They are not entitled for the employee benefits and all. So most of them, about 90% as we saw, are unorganized in India. So formalizing these, that is mainstreaming this sector, can bring about a perceptible change, and that is what the committee says. Next is increasing the productivity. So what is increasing the productivity? We all are producing something or the other, correct? So productivity would get increased only when the amount of effort that we put inside gets translated to the amount of output that we are expecting. Say we are putting a lot of effort and we are getting a very little output, then it means the productivity is very low. So how do we increase the productivity? The most common solution to increase the productivity is science. That is, technologically, the productivity process needs to be fine-tuned. For example, textile sectors in India, they largely rely on age-old techniques to produce the garments. And that is exactly why India is falling behind Vietnam kind of countries in the race to export the textiles. So increasing the productivity is not only important to tackle the unemployment and joblessness, but it is also important to increase the exports and the trade within the country. Alright, and next is strengthening and upgrading the existing livelihoods. So let us understand this also better. Say consider a poor household, they are working every day and they take home the money from the work every day, and some medical emergency happens and they are exhausting all their savings and they are borrowing also, and everyday earning from the work that they do goes towards paying the debt itself. So the net livelihood standards of that particular family goes down. Consider a scenario during the emergency, that is the medical emergency, the government is pitching in. Say the government is giving in the medical aid and it is supporting the family. Then the savings of that particular poor family is also saved, and they also are relieved from the debt that they are supposed to take to compensate for the medical expense. So this is how strengthening and upgrading the existing livelihood can be done by the government. So this is only an example about the health situation. This is also true about providing them housing, providing them education, and also providing other nutritional support. That is how strengthening and upgrading the existing livelihood is done. Understand that? And coming to the next, creating new opportunities. Of course, expanding the opportunities is a very basic rule for tackling the unemployment. Correct? So coming to the next part, the committee recommended the government to explore ways and means to put in money in the bank accounts of the informal workers during the adverse conditions like the COVID. So this is more about the direct benefit transfer kind of help that the committee is saying. And apart from this, the government, both at the central and the state levels, should encourage and introduce entrepreneurial opportunities. So how can this be done? The state government and the central government, they can give them skill support, they can give them money support, they can give them marketing support. So this is the support that the committee is expecting from the central and the state government. This, as a means of sustenance, would help in reducing unemployment and supporting recovery. Alright, further, the government shall focus on creating a large number of skill development programs and projects. So this would ensure availability of quality manpower to cater to the needs of the economy. So what is the needs of the economy? If you think about 30 years back, so if you say data entry, it means writing the data on a notebook. Okay, keeping accounts in a notebook is also data entry. But right now, if you ask what is data entry, it means entering the data in the computer. So the needs of the economy has changed. So a person who is writing in the book will not be able to find a job in this era. So it is important for the person to reskill her skill set in tandem with the industry needs, and that is what the committee is meaning by this. Okay, and as per the report, in the short or the immediate term, it is imperative to expand the social assistance and the public welfare programs both in urban and the rural areas. So this is to provide relief and protection to the most vulnerable and the disadvantaged strata of the society. And the committee recommended the Ministry of Labour also to suo motu take efforts to list the cases of termination of workers during the lockdown. So what does it mean? During the lockdown, a lot of people were fired by their employers because either they were not producing anything or they just wanted to cut down the expenses. So a lot of workers were fired, and Ministry of Labour themselves, they should be able to support the workers who are filing suits in the court so that they can get their work back. And Ministry of Labour shall be of help, and that is what the committee is recommending. And coming to the next recommendation, the committee also expressed its concerns over the states like Delhi, Chhattisgarh, Assam and West Bengal, because these states, they're not implementing one nation one ration card scheme. See, this one nation one ration card scheme is very beneficial for migrant workers, because say consider an employee working in Kerala from Uttar Pradesh. So the person will have a ration card of Uttar Pradesh, but she will be able to procure the rice and wheat and dal from Kerala with the one nation one ration card scheme. This is immensely of benefit for the migrant workers, and these states and the NCT, they have not been implementing this one nation one ration card scheme, and so the report has urged the ministry to take up the matter with these 4 state governments so that they get themselves integrated with the ORC, and this would enable the National Food Security Act beneficiaries in these states to have access to their entitled food grains from any public distribution system in the country. So the next suggestion is regarding Manrega. See, the committee has desired that the intended benefits under Manrega scheme should be made individual specific instead of family centric. So this would depict a clear picture of the actual number of individual beneficiaries. And also, the government should consider increasing the work allocation under the scheme to at least 200 days per year, so as to effectively cater to the growing job demands. So these are the recommendations given by the country, and in the first part we also saw about the India's unemployment status. The entire discussion that we just went through right now is good enough for a mains answer. You can build 250 words out of this in case you are asked one such question in your main exam. Alright, so with that knowledge in mind, let's move on to the next segment of today's discussion. Now look at this op-ed article. This op-ed article enlightens us about the advantages of horizontal reservation for women in our country and the need for it, and author explains this using the example of Bihar. So in this discussion, let us dwell into the aspects such as the social status of women in India, what is horizontal reservation, we will understand this against vertical reservation, and about the recent decision. So here is the syllabus relevant for this particular discussion. So as you are aware, reservation is an affirmative action of the government through which it aims to correct the historic inequalities and provide substantial equality. So affirmative action means the positive steps taken to increase the representation of minorities and women in the areas where they have been historically excluded. Say for example, women have been historically discouraged from going to work. So that is exactly why in employments the Bihar government is proposing a horizontal reservation, right? So this is the objective of affirmative action. And these areas include employment, education and others. And apart from that, the Constitution provides space for this affirmative action of reservation also. We know about Article 15 and Article 16, which provides for affirmative action in employment as well as education. But all reservations are not of the same nature. So based on this, reservation can be divided into 2 types. They are the vertical reservations and the horizontal reservations. See, let us understand these. Vertical reservation refers to the social reservations in favor of the scheduled caste people or the scheduled tribe people or the other backward classes people. For example, say the Constitution provides reservation to the backward classes under Article 16(4) in matters of public employment. Now this is vertical reservation. So the entire pie of the jobs or education, some amount is given to the vulnerable. So That is as simple as that, and that is vertical reservation. Now let us look into horizontal reservation. See, on the other hand, horizontal reservations are special reservations within the vertical reservations. So these are the reservations which are in favor of persons with disabilities or women, etc. Generally, that is how it is given. See, Constitution contemplates vertical reservation under Article 16.1 and Article 15.3. For example, under Article 15.3, Constitution enables a state to make any special provision for women and children, and such a provision also includes reservation. So, a provision for women made under Article 15.3 in respect of employment can be a special reservation, and it stands different from the social reservation under Article 16.4. See, but in reality, we often see that horizontal reservations cut across the vertical reservations. So this is called interlocking reservations. See, let us take a small example to understand that. And this is the scenario right now that is practiced in India as well. So understand that. See, these numerics that I am going to use right now is imaginary only, just for you to understand. So let us say 3% of the vacancies in a government job are reserved in favor of physically handicapped people. So this would be a reservation relatable to Article 16.1 and is a horizontal reservation. Then this means the person selected against 3% quota will be placed in the appropriate category. That is, if she belongs to the scheduled caste category, she will be placed in that quota by making necessary adjustments. So this actualizes vertical reservation. So both the criteria are fulfilled. See, the important fact to be observed here is, even after providing for these horizontal reservations, the percentage of reservations in favor of backward class of citizens, that is vertical reservation, remains the same, and it should remain the same. So that is what we said, the horizontal reservation forms a part of the vertical reservation pie. Okay, and two important points you should remember regarding the vertical and the horizontal reservation. Let's remember that one by one. First is that the special reservation of horizontal reservation does not mean that the remaining portion will be totally reserved for the non-special category. For example, assume there are 200 vacancies for some post or for some educational institution. In this, 15% is the vertical reservation for the ST candidates, and 30% is the horizontal reservation for women. So, the proper description of the number of posts reserved for the scheduled caste candidates should be this: 30 posts for scheduled caste candidates, and out of that 30, 9 posts are reserved for women, and this is the proper reservation. But often what happens is, many think that since 9 posts are for women, the remaining 21 out of the 30 are reserved for men. See, this is a wrong assumption, because there is no stipulated reserved category for the male, and that is exactly why the remaining 21 will be an open category where both men and women belonging to that particular category can compete. Understand that? And next is the principle regarding unreserved places. See, when there is a vertical reservation for backward classes, then it means that the candidates belonging to such backward classes may also compete for the non-reserved post. And if they are appointed in the non-reserved post on their own merit, then their number will not be counted against the quota reserved for the respective backward classes. Rather, they will be considered under the unreserved quota only. This means the entire reservation quota is available in addition to the open category. So, in addition is very important. So, the people who are vulnerable, that is the backward classes or the scheduled castes or the scheduled tribal people, they are free to compete in any category which is kept open for competition for anybody. Okay? And remember this principle is applicable to the vertical reservations, and this will not apply to the horizontal reservations. So these are the basics that you need to understand. So why did we talk this topic? Because of the recent decision of the Bihar government. See, recently Bihar government announced 33% of reservation for women in the state engineering and medical colleges. See, this is a very welcome move, and this is a horizontal reservation move. So this takes us to the question as to why do we need such a reservation? See, first is to improve the female labor force participation rate in India. See, the female labor force participation is very important to boost the economy. See, when you see the entire cohort of workforce is either male or female, at least conventionally that is how it is being perceived, right? So what happens is there is a good participation from the men, but the rest 50% of the population sees very minimal participation, and so their contribution to the economy either goes uncounted or they just don't participate in a formal economic setup. So this is very low. When the females enter the labor force, the participation rate increases and the economy also thrives. All these takes us to the question, why is that women's participation in the labor force is less? See, this is due to the existing social and the cultural norms, which determines whether women's activities are regarded as economic or not. So let's take an example. In many low-income countries, women often work on farms or in family enterprises, but without pay. That is, they are not paid for the household work, and that is what we call as unpaid work. So it is often not included under the labor force participation. So this is what I called as the unaccounted for labor in the earlier part of today's discussion, right? And another reason for the low female labor force participation is the low employment opportunities for women after matriculation and graduation. See, according to World Bank, what it says is the female labor force participation is consistently declining since 2005 for India, and Bihar is no exception. And for Bihar, it is much lower than the national average itself. That is, it is performing much worse compared to the other peers. So, horizontal reservation in such a state can ensure that women are ready for the workforce. And the second need for horizontal reservation is to reduce the gender disparity in the social, political and the economic arenas. So, this takes us to the question as to what can be done to improve this sad state. First and the foremost is that the state and the central welfare schemes should be employed to overcome the patriarchal control of women and the systemic gender discrimination. Here, authors have suggested to learn from the state, because Bihar enforced various programs in the last 3 decades, and these were mainly focused on women empowerment and improving the representation of women in the various fields. For example, as a progressive measure in 1992 itself, what Bihar did was it announced 2 consecutive days of menstrual leave for women employees in government services. So this is a policy that even doesn't exist for the central government employees. And such initiatives encourage women to enter the labor force. And we can also take another reformist example from Bihar itself. So in 2013, Bihar reserved 35% of seats for women in police recruitment. And many such initiatives of Bihar can be taken as a precedent by the central and the state governments. And apart from that, the government should also work towards reducing female dropouts from schools and colleges as well. So this could be achieved through the first point that we discussed. And thirdly, the author suggests to fill the vacancies in the various sectors in the government departments with women workers. See, this has multi-fold advantages. First is the women will get employment. Second is the women will get financial independence. And third, when they are put in the government sector or when they are taken in the police department, they will understand the women better in the society, and this will help in gender sensitive policy making and decision making. So these are the advantages of making the working population more diverse. Alright, so this brings us to the end of the discussion on this particular op-ed. So in this discussion, we saw what is horizontal reservation. We saw that horizontal reservation is a part of the vertical reservation pie. And we also saw about Bihar's decision to give 33% horizontal reservation for women and the repercussions that the decision can have for the women community's betterment. Okay, so with that information in mind, let us move on to the next segment of today's discussion. Now, look at this editorial. The author has written this editorial regarding the India-US relationship, and it is regarding the recent tour that a US diplomat had taken. So, in this context, let us discuss the important phases and events of India-US ties, because that is more relevant for us. So, this is a high priority recurring topic. Pay attention, this is very much important from the mains perspective. Alright, so let us go into the discussion. So here is the syllabus. So it is very relevant from the GS2 perspective. First, let us go back to 1947, that is independence. We can describe this phase as a inconsistent friendship phase. See, we can say that period from 1947 to 1974 had phases of agreements as well as disagreements in the US-India relations. And initially, US was cordial with India. It supported India's struggle for independence, and in 1950, US was even ready to remove China as a permanent member of United Nations Security Council and instead put India in its place. So you can imagine the amount of friendship that was blossoming between India and US. So things were good. But in 1953, things changed. What happened was the Korean War was happening, and see, the US believed that India sided with Soviet Union and China in the Korean War scenario, and we know US and Soviet Union were always in loggerheads, right? So this made the US tilt away from India, and the US started moving closer to Pakistan because of this, and the US started giving aids and armaments to our neighbors, and we know that strengthened the Pakistan also. And next came the non-alignment movement also. See, in 1961, India formally proclaimed neutrality through the non-alignment movement. So, India did not take any sides during the Cold War, and this neutrality slowly deteriorated the India-US relations. But things weren't all bleak. Some good things happened also. For example, in 1962, the United States helped India to establish one of the first IITs at the Kanpur. And also in 1962, during the Indo-China War and all, US supported India in the conflict. That is, it raised the voice for India's case. And we can't forget the Green Revolution also. The US was one of the significant supporters of India during the Green Revolution. And this revolution transformed India from a food scarce nation to a self-sufficient powerhouse. Now, we are also a net exporter of the agricultural products. But the US support to India was not consistent also. It was wavering. Now, fast forward to 1971. During the India-Pakistan war, the US supported Pakistan, which is India's enemy. So, we can observe that this period had phases of agreement as well as disagreement in the India-US relations. So, that is exactly why we call this phase as inconsistent friendship. Now, coming to 1974 period and beyond that. So, this we call it as an era of estrangement. See, the period from 1974 to 2001 saw greater estrangement between India and US. Let us understand why. Because in 1974, India detonated its first nuclear device, and India became the first nation outside the United Nations Security Council to have declared a nuclear capability. See, this is a formidable feat at that time, and this pushed the US away from India, and probably it got jealous or probably it got suspicious about India, but US pulled itself away from India. And India also conducted its second series of nuclear tests in 1998. So this widened the gap even further, and India also faced economic sanctions from the US because of these tests, and that is exactly why we call the period from 1974 to 2001 as an era of estrangement. See, only in the year 2000 things started getting slightly better. This is because in 2000 the president Bill Clinton made the first US presidential trip to India since 1978. So this considerably eased the thaw between the India and US. So this visit initiated the ending of the estrangements, and finally in 2001 the US lifted the sanctions that were imposed on India after its 1998 nuclear test. This event ended the phase of estrangement and started an era of friendship. See, after this, India started moving closer to the US. And in 2005, India signed a series of agreements like the Energy Security Dialogue, New Framework for Defense Relationship, and Civil Nuclear Cooperation Initiative (CNCI) with the US. Similarly, in 2008, the Nuclear Suppliers Group allowed an exemption to its rules to permit India to engage in the nuclear trade for the first time in 3 decades. See, India was kept away from the Nuclear Suppliers Group because India was a believer of non-proliferation. Completely, India wanted to ban the nuclear supplies. But the NSG stand slightly opposed to this principle. So, India did not become a part of NSG, but it was given an exemption to engage in nuclear trade. And this was possible only because of the United States. And India also signed 4 foundational military agreements with the US. And India signed the first agreement in 2002, that is General Security of Military Information Agreement. This is first. And recently, LAMOA, that is Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, was signed in 2016. And in 2018, Communications Capability and Security Agreement, that is COMCASA, was signed. And in 2020, very recently, Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement was signed. See, all these 4 are very important and they are considered as a turning point in the India-US defense relations. So pay attention and keep that in mind. And United States also elevated India to a major defense partner in 2016. And the US has also identified India as a key ally in the Indo-Pacific region to check the Chinese aggression. So you may also recollect us talking about the Quad grouping also, mainly as a counter to the China factor, isn't it? So India, US, Japan, Australia are major partners in Quad, if you remember. So that is one major development in the India-US relations. So all these events show that India and US are getting closer. So this doesn't mean that everything is merry between India and US. Alright? India and US also have trade barriers. That is, India is accused of having very high import tariff. So for example, if you take the Harley Davidson bike and all, so they have like 100% custom duty. That is, you'll have to pay 100% of the price as a tax only. So you can imagine the escalation of price within the Indian borders. That's just an example. That is one trade barrier that US is trying to minimize with India, and that is one sore point between India-US relations. And apart from that, we always had issues about Indians going to America and settling there and taking their jobs. So that is one point of thaw between India and US. And India and US's defense ties are also not a straight line. The contours are quite twisted, with the Russia factor coming in, the Pakistan factor coming in, the China factor coming in. Okay, so that is also one area where India-US relations are not very merry. So these are some of the sore points that India and US have in their relationship, but it can be boldly said that since 2000, India and US friendship has only been getting better, and India and US are getting close. And let us hope that this friendship gets stronger in the new US administration. So this brings us to the end of this part of editorial. See, a mains question that can ask you to trace the evolution of the India and the US relations can be answered with this particular discussion. Alright, so with that information in mind, let's move on to the next segment of today's discussion. Now let us take up this news article for discussion. So this news article revolves around the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. It was enacted in 2016, and since then it has come a long way in resolving the insolvencies and bankruptcies. And this code was enacted when it was identified that the non-performing assets were piling up. So in that context, this was enacted, and this has done a lot to revive the economy. So let us look about it. So this session, students, will be more of an understanding session rather than a takeaway session. So pay attention. This is going to be more of a elucidation of the insolvency and the bankruptcy code. Now let's go on to the discussion. See, this reform, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, is an amalgamation of various laws relating to the insolvency resolution of business firms. See, we know that we have a huge amount of bad loans in India. Even right now we have. And these bad loans were bringing our economy down. So that is why this code was enacted. And this code lays down clear-cut and faster insolvency proceedings. And this will help the creditors such as banks to recover dues and prevent bad loans piling up. So who are the creditors? Creditors means the person who gives out the loan, the person who gives out the money when asked for. So that person is a creditor, and more often than not, in a corporate setup, the creditors are usually banks, or they raise their money through shares. So now we have a question. What is insolvency? What is bankruptcy? Let us understand that. See, insolvency is a situation where the individuals or the companies are unable to repay their outstanding debt. Let us understand that. See, some company is taking money to run their business, to invest in some machinery or something, but the business doesn't take off well. So they are not able to make any profits, and they are not able to repay the amount that they are going to repay to someone. So they are not able to repay that, and that particular part is what is called as the outstanding debt. Alright, so this is what is insolvency, is where a situation where the individual or companies are unable to repay. Simple. So what is bankruptcy then? See, bankruptcy is a situation whereby a court of a competent jurisdiction has declared a person or other entity insolvent. So in other words, bankruptcy is a legal declaration of insolvency. So by law, we say someone is insolvent, then the person is called bankrupt. Okay, and it is a legal declaration of one's inability to pay off the debts. So I hope you understand bankruptcy now. So the main difference between insolvency and bankruptcy is this. Insolvency refers to a situation, whereas bankruptcy is a legal state. Only when the insolvency is uncovered or when it is brought to light, it becomes bankruptcy, because it comes under a legal radar. Okay? And if you are insolvent, you are simply not in a position to pay off your debt. Whereas if you are declared bankrupt, then you have to pay off your debt by either selling off your assets or by restructuring payment processes with the government's help. So insolvency is a state of being, and bankruptcy is the conclusion. So bankruptcy is a way to repay your debts also. So the government will help you do that. And not all insolvencies will lead to the declaration of bankruptcy also. Pay attention here. Not all the insolvencies will lead to the declaration of bankruptcy, because the person or entity may remain insolvent for a while, but later on they may actually pick up their business. Probably the business will start doing well, they may earn the profit, and they may actually be able to repay. So not all insolvencies will lead to declaration of bankruptcy. Only when a person comes to a conclusion that I cannot pay the debt whatsoever, the person brings the issue to the limelight and the declaration of the bankruptcy happens. So now coming to the code. See, the code has created various institutions to facilitate resolution of insolvency. Let us see about them. See, first comes the insolvency professionals. See, insolvency professionals are a specialized cadre of licensed professionals. See, these professionals will administer the resolution process, and they will manage the assets of the debtor and provide information for the creditor to assist in decision making. So understand this better. A creditor is someone who gives out the money, right? And a debtor is someone who has taken the money. So the debtor is unable to pay back the debt, but the debtor has other assets. Say he may have another business, he may have another bungalow, he may have another plane. So it can be anything. So these professionals, they will help to manage these assets so that they can pay off the credit. And this, when a person is
declared insolvent, the decision does not solely lie on the debtor alone. So when the bankruptcy is declared, the decision will also involve the creditor. So the assets of the debtor is made transparent to the creditors, and the insolvency professionals in between, they help the creditor and the debtor to come to a conclusion as to how the debtor will repay the money to the creditor. That is how a person will repay the money with the help of other assets. Now, next comes the insolvency professional agencies. See, insolvency professionals will be registered with the insolvency professional agencies, and these agencies conduct examination to certify these insolvency professionals and thereby enforce a code of conduct for their performance as well. Okay, so the insolvency professionals are administered by the insolvency agency. Understand that. Okay, and moving on to the next, it is the information utilities. See, this is important. See, information utility is a professional organization whose function is to gather, assemble, accumulate, validate and disseminate financial information from companies and creditors to facilitate insolvency, liquidation and bankruptcy. Basically, they are information repositories. Okay, how much asset is there? How can we liquidate it? Are the assets valid? Are there any loans on those assets? You know, these kind of information is stored in the information utility, and a person can rely on the information stored in the information utility before investing itself. So this ensures that a person's investment is secured. Alright, and next comes the adjudicating authorities. See, the proceedings of the resolution process for companies will be adjudicated by the National Company Law Tribunal. And when it comes to the individual, the resolution process will be adjudicated by the Debt Recovery Tribunal. So there are two different tribunals, one for the individual and other for the companies. Okay, and the duties of these authorities will include approval to initiate the resolution process, appoint the insolvency professional and approve the final decision of the creditor. So they oversee the entire process, as you can infer. Okay, and finally comes the most important institution of the insolvency and the bankruptcy code, which is the Insolvency and the Bankruptcy Board itself. See, the Insolvency and the Bankruptcy Board regulates the insolvency professionals, insolvency professional agencies and the information utilities set up under the code. So basically it has a regulatory function, whereas the tribunal oversees and that decides the course of the proceedings of the bankruptcy itself, whereas the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board is more of a static administrative body for the insolvency professional and the professional agencies as well as the information utilities set up under the code. And the board will consist of representatives of RBI, the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Corporate Affairs and Law. So this is what the board will consist. See, in the entire discussion, we saw what are the changes that the code brought in to help the resolution process, and few days ago we also saw a discussion on this particular aspect in the context of Yes Bank and all. So if you can relate this discussion with that, that will be much more fruitful, and this particular article is also important from the preliminary point of view. So with that information in mind, let's move on to the next part of today's discussion.
Now look at this editorial. See, I'm not going to discuss this editorial in detail because we have been discussing extensively about US's exit from Afghanistan and how the norms have been reached and the consensus has been reached based on the Doha Accord and what the Trump government has done and what the Biden government has done and how the US troops are pulling out on the 11th of September. And all these things we have been discussing very extensively, and we have also been discussing what is India's role in the entire process and how this move by the US will affect the security paradigm in India. So I'm not going to discuss this in detail, but there's a small takeaway which is very interesting from this particular editorial. This author has likened the US's exit from the Afghanistan to that of US's exit from Vietnam in 1973. So this has given a different perspective from the author's
point of view. But anyways, in 1973, US withdrew from the Vietnam after a long drawn war. There was a tie and it was almost like the US was losing. But after it visited China and after it tied up with China and after it made its sole enemy Soviet Union stand alone, it kind of pulled out. But the case may or may not be very similar in the Afghanistan, and the US is pulling out on the sole belief that Taliban, which is and which was the US's enemy, may not harm the US in the long run. So that is the hope that US is wielding exit, and that is what is exactly discussed in this particular editorial. So I'm not going to discuss this in detail because we have already discussed this extensively. Now look at this particular editorial. This particular editorial, The Problems of Prediction, talks about the statistical calculation difficulties in calculating the pandemic trajectory. See, so many models we have discussed. Even in our own series, we have discussed a lot of models for pandemic projection. But author finds a lot of flaws in the pandemic projection solely based on the data input. And all these is not very relevant in our exam point of view. But one takeaway is about the excess deaths that is being calculated. So this excess death concept was discussed by me on the 31st discussion. So I'm not going to go into detail of this particular discussion. So you may all recollect what is an excess death and how we are calculating it. Moving on to the next article. So this particular article is about poverty in India, and especially of course in the context of pandemic and how is it worsened. And one of recent Kirtana ma'am's class also talks about poverty. So I'm not going to waste your time talking about poverty and the ways how it is calculated and everything in detail again, especially with the prelims around the corner. So with that discussion, we are at the fag end of today's session, that is practice preliminary questions. See, we have 3 questions for discussion today on that direction. Let's go over it one by one. So the first question asks us to match the desert with the country. See, the local names for the deserts are very different, and that is exactly why this question is challenging us. So let's go over it one by one. See, the first option is this, Rubalkali. See, Rubalkali is the Arabic name which means empty quarter. Okay, and this particular desert is a region in southern Arabian Peninsula, and it constitutes the largest portion of Arabian desert. So with that we can say Rubalkali is a part of Saudi Arabia. Now second option is this, Dast-e Kavir and Iraq. See, we know from the discussion that this pair is correctly matched. So 1 and 2 are correctly matched. And let's go to the third one. Third one is the Ramlat Tawak, and this is matched with Oman. See, Ramlat Tawak is one of the deserts of the Oman, which is well known for the area of beautiful sand dunes. So this Ramlat Tawak is, yes, of course, placed in Oman. So the correct option is option D, 1, 2 and 3. That is, all the 3 pairs are correctly matched. Moving on to the next question. Look at this. So this is in reference to the parliamentary committees of Lok Sabha. So it's a 2-statement question, and we are asked to identify the correct statement. See, the first statement is this. It is elected by the House or nominated by the Speaker and works under the direction of the Speaker. See, this statement is correct. See, the parliamentary committee means a committee which is appointed by or elected by the House, or it can also be a nominated body by the Speaker. And these committees, what they do is they work under the direction of the Speaker, and it represents its report to the House or the Speaker, and the secretariat for these particular committees are provided by the Lok Sabha Secretariat. So with that information, we know statement 1 is correct. Now coming to statement 2. The standing committees are appointed for a specific purpose, and they cease to exist when they finish the task assigned to them. See, by their nature, parliamentary committees are of 2 kinds. First is the standing committee, another one is ad hoc committee. See, by the name ad hoc, we know that ad hoc committees are appointed for a specific purpose, and it is these ad hoc committees that cease to exist when they finish the task given to them. Whereas these standing committees, they continue to exist, and they are assigned different purposes at different point of time. So the ad hoc committees are the one who are temporary, whereas the standing committees are permanent. So this makes the statement 2 incorrect. So our option is Option A, 1 only. Moving on to the third question, it talks about the insolvency, which we discussed in the discussion today. It asks which of the following acts as insolvency regulator in India. So we have 4 options. First is the National Companies Law Tribunal. Second is Reserve Bank of India. Third option is Ministry of Finance. And the fourth option is Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board. See, the insolvency regulator, according to the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code 2016, is the Insolvency and the Bankruptcy Board of India. So this is the one that oversees the insolvency proceedings in the country, and it regulates the entities registered under it. And this particular board will consist of representatives from RBI, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Corporate Affairs and Law. This we saw as a part of our discussion today. So with that, we can wrap up the prelims question discussion.
So that brings us to the end of today's discussion. Here are some of the mains questions. Write the answers and post it in the comment section. See, writing 1 or 2 answers every day will give you a significant edge in your GS preparation for the mains. So let's wrap up our discussion today. If you like the video, like, share, comment and subscribe. Stay home, stay safe. Good day.